reminder. In our last episode, we discussed the historical context in which Emerson lived, that it was a time of great social change, the Transcendentalist community that was in Boston at the time, the importance of his group of friends that he was connected with, his belief in idealism, and the reality of ideas and the close association with Platonism, his concept of the divine being within, his interest in mind and the religious nature of man, his connections with Unitarianism in America, but also that his life was filled with tragedy and there were lots of disappointments and things that he had to overcome. His decision to go to divinity school, and his decision to leave divinity school, where he really struck out on his own, as well as the death of his first wife, Ellen. So today, after his wife, Ellen, died, and he peered into her coffin, and it struck him that it was a moment of clarity for him that he needed to take his life in his own hands, and he took off for Europe. He had a long trip to Europe in 1832. And at first, you might think that being a very this worldly type of person as he was, that he would have not liked Catholicism, but actually he warmed very much to the Catholicism that was in Italy, to the churches, the monasteries, the very soothing rituals. He really liked it. He loved Rome. He loved Villa d'Este, which is a beautiful place outside of Rome. He went to Geneva, and he had a wake-up moment, an epiphany, when he was visiting a place called the Jardin des Plantes. It was just a botanical garden. And it was a moment of incredible visionary intensity that really marked a beginning for him. And he wrote after that in his journal, he said, "I feel the centipede in me, caiman, carp, eagle, and fox." And he really acknowledged at that point that there was an unbreakable relationship between the natural world and the human mind. At that time, he had the opportunity to meet Samuel Taylor Coleridge in person, to meet William Wordsworth, John Stuart Mill, and Thomas Carlyle, with whom he formed a lifelong friendship. When he did meet with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was already older at the time, he noted that Coleridge talked the entire time and dominated the entire discussion. But when he met with Carlyle, who was another essayist, they really, and really a brilliant and creative mind, they really formed quite a bond. He had started becoming famous around 1827, and he wrote something called Sartor Resartus, which sounds like it was really which basically like sartorial, the word sartorial having to do with tailoring and sewing, and it had to do with tailor retailored, and it was about somebody called Diogenes Teufelsdroch, which means basically Zeus-born devil dung, and it was a kind of a parody on German idealism. It sounds like it was quite creative and funny, and someday I would like to read that. But they developed a very strong friendship, and Emerson has famously said of Carlyle, "What a living soul, what a universal knowledge." And he also wrote about humanity's preconditioned disposition to belief, which was something that Emerson was very attracted to. He also visited William Wordsworth, who was very, very kind to him as well. So he formed a lot of really important connections. When he came back from that trip, which was really influential in his life, he met a woman called Mary Roch. Mary Roch was part of what they call the Progressive New Light Quakers. And he felt that for him, that of all of the Protestant denominations, that Quakerism was something that really resonated him. Quakerism talked about the religious authority in the individual and had a profound effect on Emerson's direction. It helped him to discovering the power of the inmost self, and they had lots of ideas about the inner light, inwardness, centered on inward intercourse with God rather than prohibitions or theology or rules and that kind of thing. And they often use the metaphor of the eye, which is something that you'll find throughout Emerson's writing as well. After he came back, he went to live at a place called the Old Manse, M-A-N-S-E, as in old mansion. And this is where he went to live with his step-grandfather, Ezra Ripley. And it's kind of interesting about who Ezra Ripley was. This house had built by his grandfather, William Emerson, who fought in the Revolutionary War and who died of, I think, typhus in the Revolutionary War. He was, of course, a minister like everybody in Emerson's family was. And then after the grandfather died, this guy, Ezra Ripley, came along. He became the minister of the church that was his grandfather's church. He married his wife and he went and lived in his house. So he basically just took over everything that was William Emerson's. But Emerson he had a lot of, it was a good place for him to write and to study. Actually, at some point, Nathaniel Hawthorne and his wife, Elizabeth Peabody, I spoke earlier about the Peabody sisters, actually went to live here. And so Nathaniel Hawthorne had done quite a bit of writing in this house as well. And he found his grandfather, Ezra Ripley, a bit hard to put up with, kind of a stodgy old guy. But it was a really good place for him to work. And his mother also came to live there, and his brother Charles. And it's always interesting to see how much family was living together at the time. It happened often, and his mother was often living with him. At this time in American history, it was really, you could call it the high point of American oratory. There was a very high demand for lecturers, and it was a part of what they called the Lyceum movement. I think I talked about that last time. Over the course of his entire life, Emerson actually gave 1,500 different lectures. And the Lyceum movement during the 1850s, there's a statistic that says that 5% of the adult population of the Northeast and Midwest actually attended a Lyceum lecture on a weekly basis. The lectures were not supposed to be technical or specialized. They were seasoned by theatricality and wit. And at first there was no political partisanship. Later on, Emerson becomes very politicized, and of course his lectures do include political tone, but he had a unique niche in the lecture circuit. He was one of the top 10 performers. Margaret Fuller described him as saying he spoke with a baritone voice. It would be interesting to hear him speak. He had a large, slender frame, and he was able to really hold audiences rapt. His lecture style was fast-paced, quick shifting. He often used a kind of a riddlesome type of style. There's a description of him as being dexterously sententious. How do you like that for a phrase? Invigorating and slightly enigmatic at times. He admired improvisation, but his lectures were by no means improvisations. He was reading from his journals and notebooks and putting together lectures, so it was fairly structured in its approach. Listening to one of his lectures one day, was his second wife, Ellen. Excuse me, not Ellen, Lydia. And she eventually changed her name after they got married to Lydienne. Nobody's really sure. Maybe Emerson convinced her that it sounded more intellectual, or maybe he was concerned that with the Boston accent, people would call her Lydia or Emerson. So if you say Lydienne Emerson, it sounds better, but she changed her name from Lydia Jackson to Lydienne Emerson. And she herself was a very intellectual person, and that their relationship was formed. It was a meeting of the minds. She was a like-minded spirit that spoke to his deepest self. She was interested in consciousness, and they shared at first a lot of excitement and in their learning and their sharing of ideas. And he admired her air of lofty abstraction. I think eventually her air of lofty abstraction kind of got to him, but at first it was very much appealing. They were married in 1835. There's a story that goes that she was upstairs preparing, putting on her gown, etc. And it was delayed, and he was becoming impatient, and he said, what the heck is she doing up there? So he went upstairs and he got her, and they came down the stairs together. So there was no walking down the aisle or anything like that. So that might be indicative start of the marriage. And then he was very much into making his home a very welcoming place. And the first night on their honeymoon, he said, oh, by the way, some of my friends that came into Boston for the wedding, I invited them to stay over tonight. So she had to scurry around and prepare the place, and that made her quite nervous. But that was the start of the marriage. They had a very, very open home, lots of visitors, and they actually called their house Bush. For whatever reason, they decided to call it Bush. A really interesting and important theme for Emerson, as well as for the Romantic poets, was this idea of the moment of illumination, the transformative moment, or the moment of epiphany. Epiphany is one of my favorite words. It comes from the Greek epi, meaning on, plus phanein, which means to show. And it means to manifest, display, show off, or come suddenly into view. And Emerson was always seeking that moment of revelation. The French word is l'aperçu, a glimpse, a hint, an immediate moment of understanding. The kind of experience that he was always reaching for was this kind of ecstatic state, an experience that gives you the feeling of being outside time. And his feeling was that life often fluctuates between epiphany and then blankness, just kind of going along, and then suddenly the consciousness breaks open. He felt that the great turning points in life were not events, but moments of illumination like this. And these experiences like that were sources of power and vision. And he felt that every person has in them several moments of these extraordinary kind of moments in their life. And he was at pains to demystify them. He felt that these moments were, it's not just for ecstatics or mystics. It was for scientists and mathematicians as well. And, we talked last week about Goethe being very into studies about light and science, that there was, having these moments in which there's a perception of the unity of the multiplicity of phenomenon. And I read a book by a man named Frank Wilczek, who was a Nobel Prize winning scientist. And he wrote a book called A Beautiful Question, Finding Nature's Deep Design. And he said that even scientists shouldn't lose that sense of wonder that the world embodies beautiful ideas. At this time, there was a poet, he died young, so unfortunately we don't know much of his work, but his name was Novalis, a young German romantic poet, but he was also into science and math. And he talked about mathematics as the power of mathematics to lift us above the cares of everyday life. And he actually advocated, he said, studying algebra can be a method of healing. And being a geometer myself, and I mean, I wouldn't call myself a mathematician per se, but I understand that mathematics in itself does embody the world of the ideas, things that are true eternally, but which you can't necessarily touch and feel. Plato actually talked about something called the propaedeukon. I love that word, and which is partially why I'm interested in geometry, that studying geometry could be a kind of a purification or an exercise in pure thought that exalts the phenomenal world above into the world of the ideal. So, Emerson, of course, also discussed the ecstatic experience as it relates to nature, that the world itself is a great, beautiful poem. He used the concept of willed surrender, the giving oneself over to these epiphanies of every day. And one of the quotations that he had that I think is really beautiful, he said, "In every week, there is some hour when I read my commission in every cipher of nature and know that I was made for another office, a professor of the joyous science, a detector and delineator of occult harmonies and unpublished beauties, a herald of civility, nobility, learning, and wisdom, an affirmer of the one law, yet as one who should affirm it in music or dancing, a priest of the soul, yet one who would better love to celebrate it through the beauty of health and harmonious power." So I think that gives you a really good idea of his style of writing, as well as the quality of his thought. Emerson, I think I mentioned this last week, he was more interested in being considered as a poet really than as a lecturer. He knew, as in those days was often the case, he knew vast amounts of Milton and Wordsworth by heart. His feeling was that there's a role of the poet as an insightful being who pierces this rotten diction and fastens words to invisible things, thereby liberating us from the worn out aspects of language. So you can see he's trying to keep language fresh and meaningful, so that it leads people to higher truths. He said that a poet is a man without an impediment, somebody that has the power to receive and to impart. They're sort of a magus, like a magi, the root of the word magic, or a shaman, that using words as vehicles to break through. Emerson said, "Art is the path of the creator to his work." And one of his other quotations that's really wonderful, he says, "We are children of the fire, made of it." And this too is a very Platonic sort of idea, that this fire, this spirit, this divine thing runs through us as human beings. Life can be an ecstasy, and poetry liberates. It's not just words on the page. It's actually the event or the feeling behind the words that the poet is trying to help people get to. And that to create is a proof of a divine presence. At the same time, to Emerson, the common man was also a poet. One of the couple of quotations from him, he says, "But all men have the thoughts whereof the universe is the celebration. Some choose words and some others choose different occupations. He rejected the idea that the poet is in any way a superior person or has access to insights that anyone could have. He said, there are none who do not love the earnest of the north wind, of rain, of stone and wood and iron. So it's really very much of a democratic aesthetic, and something that I can relate to too, that, you know, somebody that is works with wood, or heck, a really good plumber, or you see this all over the place, where people that are just really good at what they do in all walks of life, and they too are poets living a poetic life, living with passion and a spark of the divine. And of course, Emerson talked about nature as a path to beauty and the cosmos, poetry being a part of that. He has one of his famous poems. I remember I had to read it in 10th grade American literature class, was called The Rhodora. And he said in that poem, if eyes were made for seeing, then beauty is its own excuse for being. In another poem that he wrote, beautiful poem called Each and All, he said, again I saw, again I heard the rolling river, the morning bird, beauty through my senses stole, I yielded myself to the perfect whole. And I just think that's a really, really beautiful thing. Just a little bit more about, he actually did have kind of, you might say there's Emersonian linguistics, that words, what he said, words are the horses of thought. And every word, he considered every word to be sort of like a poem or a metaphor in its own right. Each spoken word represents some immaterial mental truth. So here you see we're getting a connection between that world of the eidos, or the world of the ideal world, and the world which is expressed in words. That these words are touching upon that energy, and that words themselves are modes of divine energy. He said a word is like a poetry fossil, and of course he actually considered nature and to operate in much the same way as words, that like nature is a sign of beauty, a sign of divine order, just as words can be seen in that light. Emerson, as a writer, he always strove for originality. I think you can see in some of the quotations that I've given that he had a very fresh writing style. He had kind of short declarative sentences. And like, for example, he would say things like, we are always getting ready to live, but never living. There's a rhythm to it that's very, very typical for him. He used aphorism, which was a neoclassical practice, as well as a component of wisdom literature, like for example, components of the Old Testament being what they call wisdom literature. I think we have all heard of the what is it? The hobgoblin of little minds. Conformity is the hobgoblin of little minds. You know, that was one of his, quotable quotes from Ralph Waldo Emerson. No, not conformity, consistency. I knew it was something like that. He always made a attempt to connect difficult ideas with very concrete language. So a good example, because he didn't want his ideas to go floating off into the air. That wasn't the kind of person that he was. He was, for example, he said, what is there of the divine in a load of bricks? What of the divine in a barber's shop or a privy? Much, all. So it's just very, it's like, what of the divine is there in a privy? He said, drop adjectives, let the nouns do the work. So it's a very, very strong use of language. And he's seeking the type of language that would allow him to make direct statements about things that he has strong personal intuitions about. And of course, he's keeping, speaking of words, he's keeping many, many notebooks of his ideas and stuff throughout his life. He had an increasing pile of notebooks building up. Going back to his marriage and his lifestyle at this time, his life could be described as what you called placidly strenuous. I can relate to that. And his wife actually called him Mr. Emerson. So there was a sort of a formality, and maybe she was joking around, but she was known to be maintain a kind of a coolness. She did love him very much. But there was a sort of a distance between them. She was, right from the first night on their honeymoon, she was, what I think, overly conscious about housekeeping. She would just really freak out unnecessarily, in my view, if people were coming over, keeping it clean and keeping the menu and the groceries and whatever she was upset about. And she would also had her moments of, like, really, she felt a kind of blackness and kind of a hopeless despair. So we'll see that as being, I think that contributed to some difficulty later on in their marriage. And you can actually see in this picture of Lydian's face a kind of a, she's careworn. She has concerns. She, at the same time, she was very much an intellectual. She was part of Margaret Fuller's conversations, where intellectual women in the Boston area were starting to meet and discuss things and read things. She was interested in the wave of spiritualism that a lot of people were interested in, mediums, and also very strongly against slavery and kind of working in the abolitionist movement even before Ralph Waldo got into that. One person that is really fascinating that's a part of Waldo's life is Bronson Alcott, who was the father of Louisa May Alcott. And he was a self-educated Platonist, a fascinating talker with ideas about absolutely everything. And Lydian liked him as well. She always welcomed him into their home. He is one of the religious and philosophical founders of the Transcendentalist movement. And there are some people that said he was the most transcendent transcendentalist of them all. He was really out there. He believed strongly that the world of the spirit is the only real world. And he wrote lots of essays, some of which were in the journal, The Dial, called the Orphic Sayings. He read Swedenborg, all the Neoplatonists, and just was had boundless enthusiasm and optimism, but he was also extremely impractical. He was a starry-eyed dreamer. He was known to say, "I am not perhaps sufficiently inclined to yield to the dictates of earthly prudence. I cling too closely to the ideal to take necessary advantage of the practical, and my wife and children suffer from this neglect." So he eventually relied on his very successful daughter for financial success, financial support. He really never could support his family. He was really enthusiastic about teaching and educational reform. He started something called the Temple School, and it was on the forefront of changing the way education was done. He was attracted to the ideas of a Swiss educator named Johann Pestalozzi. Pestalozzi talked about the innate personality that exists in each child that needs to be cultivated through education. And this actually goes back to the Platonic concept of anamnesis. Anamnesis means that learning is a function of remembering what we already know. Also kind of a connection to this idea of the divine within. There's a divine spark in each child. There's an intelligence in each child that's unique, that needs to be cultivated. They were not into rote learning. This was, at this time, they had field trips. That was a novel concept at that time. The children would go on field trips, and they had physical education that they started implementing, and they would learn by doing, not just by rote learning. His school, the actual physical school, had a real respect for children. It was a beautiful place. He felt that a school setting should be an atmosphere of calm and beauty for the children. Also, girls as well as boys attended. Elizabeth Peabody, who was the woman who started the West End bookstore and was a very notable feminist transcendentalist around that time, actually worked for him. And he felt that sex education, the way children were taught about sexuality, was ridiculous. And I don't think he even went as far as we would go now, or even as we would go in the 1960s, but it created a scandal in Boston. And Elizabeth ended up, because she didn't want to get her reputation dragged down by him and his crazy views of teaching children about sex, she kind of split from him, which was too bad. He started, after the Temple School failed, and this often happened with these kind of schools that were started, they needed a certain amount of students to keep paying and pay the teacher, and it just didn't work. So the Temple School failed, and Alcott started something called the Fruitlands Commune, and it lasted for a couple of years. It was a vegetarian socialist commune. And again, just very typical of Alcott, that he was very impractical. Things were disorganized. People would, do things that were, in their best, where their skill sets were, but nothing would get done. And, they didn't have any food. And actually his wife said, because they were vegetarians and they had a strong respect for animals, Mrs. Alcott, his wife said, the only working animals were the women on the farm. So I think they had a hard time getting this off the ground. In 1836, his dearest brother, Charles, died. He caught a cold, and he died just before he was going to get married to Elizabeth Hoar, Hoar. And Elizabeth Hoar was a transcendentalist intellectual in her own right, and she actually remained a part of the Emerson family, even though she never did get married to Charles. And Charles was actually Aunt Mary's favorite of the brothers. They had a very close relationship. Had he lived, it's possible that I would be giving a lecture today about Charles Emerson. But unfortunately, he died, and he and Waldo were very close. And you can say that his beautiful essay, Nature, was actually what they called an open letter to the world on behalf of Charles. So it was really, again, like his, when he lost his first wife, Ellen, when he lost his brother, Charles, it really sparked something in him, and in some ways empowered him. We go on to say a few things about the beautiful essay, Nature, which I think is kind of the epiphany moment for me. In terms of really thinking, gosh, I got to read more and learn more about this guy, because I thought it was really, really beautiful. One of the famous quotations from it is, standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. And you can see here on the screen this kind of famous cartoon that somebody did of a walking eyeball. But I think that it really sums up that when you do see something, you enter the world of mind, and that you're not really there anymore. You're in some other world. You're lost in thought, and that the mind has this capability to abolish time and space. Through the mind, we experience the unlimited. And the phrase that he had gotten from his Aunt Mary was man thinking. So man thinking is like an eyeball on a pair of legs. Yeah, so, he talked about the mind and the world as having a kind of a consciousness and connection to nature, that there was a inherent interdependence between mind and nature. The experience of the beauty of the cosmos is a wild delight, a habit of enthusiasm. So in other words, it is filled with God. And some people would say, well, that sounds like pantheism, but the term is used as hypertheism. That's kind of a coined term. So I think in some ways in nature, it goes beyond just pantheism. He uses this language of vision and rapture, speaking of light, delight, exhilaration, gladness, and that nature can furnish us with the ideas or standards of beauty that literally, so like a mountain, a tree, an animal, these are some of the primary forms of beauty, and they can give us delight in and of themselves. So he lays out here kind of a whole metaphysic, the fundamental religious world of the view that holds that nature and us in nature is part of a great allegory. Margaret Fuller is a fascinating figure in her own right, and I can't believe that I've been a feminist since 1971 when gals burned their bras at the Miss America convention, and I never heard of Margaret Fuller before. I read a book by Maria Popova, who's an interesting person, and it was called Figuring, and I recommend it to anybody. It was yummy. You could just lap your way through it. It wasn't only about Margaret Fuller, but it was primarily about Margaret Fuller. But she is a very important figure in women's history and in American history in general. She came in she had gone to some of Emerson's lectures, and then she was invited to come to his home in Concord in 1836. She was to stay for 1 week, but she ended up staying for 3 weeks. At this time, she was 21, Emerson 33, and they formed a real intellectual partnership. She had really one of the greatest minds of that time. She had received a first-rate education from her father. I think she was the firstborn, and he just, taught her everything. He was a great intellect in his own right. In 1836, her father died, leaving her as the family breadwinner. So you're seeing this theme throughout all of this. Women that are like Louisa May Alcott, for example, Margaret Fuller, Elizabeth Peabody, that they're having to figure out ways to make a living in a world that's not necessarily hospitable to them, and kind of forge their own way. Margaret Fuller was very confident. She had both masculine and feminine traits. She knew she was very smart, and she had a keen sense about her own power. She was known to say, "I now know all the people worth knowing in America, and I find no intellect comparable to my own." So how's that for self-confidence? And she probably was right. She was an amazingly intelligent person. She was vivacious, sparkling, grateful. She had a way of looking at people with her eyes half closed, they say. So there's something very unique about the way she would look at you. And they had an intellectual partnership, but she also kind of taught Emerson new ideas about social openness and kind of new standards for friendship. She had a kind of a genius for friendship in a way, at least for creating community, although some people did object to her. She created as I mentioned, the Conversation series in Boston at Elizabeth Peabody's bookstore. It went from 1839 to 1844, and it was an intellectual outlet for women. They would gather to think and talk about ideas. And the primary question that they were seeking to answer was, what were we born to do, and how shall we do it? And it was said that people that attended these lectures, they would really have life-altering experiences that as a result of attending these. She had a real intellectual hunger, starting from when she was 16 years old. She read Milton, de Staël, Racine, Epictetus, Byron, Goethe. She was a huge scholar on Goethe. And for many years, her scholarship was dominated by Goethe. You can see in this picture of her here, the way her eyes were kind of half closed in a way. And so she became a very, very strong influence on Emerson, and of course, Emerson on her, and vice versa. She wrote this book called Woman in the 19th Century, which I purchased. And honestly, I can't read it. It's such archaic kind of language. But it was very influential at that time. It was very influential to Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the onset of feminism. She was interested, I love this part of it, she was interested in mythology. And in the series, The Conversations, they would discuss mythology. And she felt that through reading mythology, women could get access to personal power and confidence. So that was interesting. She also was into what we would call a biographical idealism. She thought that the best way to tell a story or to make an idea was to talk about people's lives, what people do. And that was what she would call when the word becomes flesh. So that was Margaret. During the course of her career, she eventually went to work for Horace Greeley's New York Tribune. Horace Greeley was the one who was famous for saying, "Go west, young man." But he was really very important in his own right at the time, with his New York Tribune advocating for lots of egalitarian ideas, favoring free speech for abolitionists, supporting labor unions. He was strongly opposed to capital punishment. So she went to work for him, and he offered her to become a book reviewer and a foreign correspondent in Europe. So she went off to Europe. She met some of the same people that Emerson had met when he went there. She met George Sand, and she also met Thomas Carlyle. In 1847, she went to Italy, and she met a Italian man named Asoli, who was actually 10 years her junior, and with whom she had an illegitimate child, which was, very, very revolutionary at the time. And they may have gotten married. It's kind of unclear if they ever did get married. But at this time, so Asoli, he was from an aristocratic family, but he was working with the social reformer named Mazzini. And Mazzini was fighting they were partisans that were fighting for social democratic Republican ideas against the Pope. And, I wouldn't pretend to be able to describe all the phases of Italian history and how they had city-states and went back and forth with kings and the Pope and stuff. But Mazzini was fighting against the Pope at the time, and this guy that she affiliated herself with was fighting with Mazzini. So she worked at a hospital helping the partisans who were being wounded and fighting this war. She was literally in the middle of battles, fighting for these ideals. When this Italian cause collapsed in 1848, around 1850, she decided to come back with her young child. Actually, it didn't collapse in 1850, but it collapsed early in that. But she decided to come back to America in 1850 with her young child and Asili. And what happened was the ship captain got scarlet fever, and he died while they were on the ship coming over. And then the under captain, the sous captain or whatever, took over, and he didn't really know how to steer the ship very well. And the ship ended up crashing into some boulders and sinking right off of the New York harbor and Fire Island. And she and everybody died on that, and all of her papers, etc. One interesting thing was when Waldo heard about this, he sent Thoreau, he said, go and see if you can find littered on the beach there, her papers. We must get at these papers, because she was working on a significant work about Goethe, but Thoreau was never able to find anything after that. So it was, again, in a life of lots of disappointments and tragedies, his intellectual partner and really good friend, Margaret Fuller, died in this horrible crash. Around 1836, Emerson, with another group, mostly of Unitarian ministers, formed what they called the Transcendental Club. And this was a group of people that was seeking to have deeper and broader views on things. They wanted to open up the conversation a little bit more. And they were also people that were reading Kant, Goethe, Schleiermacher. We talked last week about Schleiermacher being the founder of liberal theology. And they met for quite a while. Some called it the Hedges Club, some called it the Aesthetic Club, some called it the Transcendental Club. And they also included women, and this was at Waldo's encouraging. So Margaret Fuller was there, Elizabeth Peabody was there, Elizabeth Hoare was there. And so Emerson was instrumental in offering kind of a public presence to different women's organizations. They had lots of exciting discussions. An example of the kind of things that they were talking about was, what is the essence of religion? And how is that distinct from morality? American genius, what are the causes that might hinder its growth? The education of humanity. Is mysticism an element of Christianity? On the character and the genius of Goethe and the nature of poetry and language. So all of these ideas they're kind of tossing around. 1836 was a very productive time for Waldo. His essay, Nature, was published at that time. His first child, Waldo, was born. He was full of energy. He was euphoric all the time. His relationship with Margaret Fuller is blossoming, and another young woman named Carolyn Sturgis, who was a beauty, wit, and a poet. He made friends with Henry Thoreau around this time, and it was really a very important time in his life. Take a drink. Around this time, abolitionism really started to heat up. he was not really ready to call himself an abolitionist yet, but he was starting to really defend the movement very, very strongly. In 1837, a pro-slavery mob brutally murdered an abolitionist man named Elijah Lovejoy. And I'd never really heard about this, but it was actually a very, very important point in history. It really mobilized a lot of sentiment. People just thought it was horrible. And it brought forth a wave of indignation throughout the whole country. As a matter of fact, when John Brown was informed about the murder, he said, "Here before God, in the presence of these witnesses, from this time I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery." And as we know the story of John Brown, he meant what he said, and he didn't succeed in the raid on Harper's Ferry. But there's also two abolitionists called the Grimke sisters, and that they were very key in the movement, and they were invited to come to the Emerson's home to speak. I had heard about the Trail of Tears and the removal of the Cherokees, and the Trail of Tears was in 1838. The American government had reneged on its treaty with the Cherokee Indians time and time again. And then finally, General Winfield Scott was put in charge of evicting the Cherokees, and they were moved to, I guess, west of the Mississippi. And Emerson was really, really upset about that. So again, it wasn't just abolitionism and feminism that was motivating him. A lot of things were kind of motivating him and politicizing him in a way. There, at least the things that he thought were going on that were just wrong. You can't talk about Transcendentalism without talking about Henry David Thoreau. He became Emerson's new friend in 1837. And Emerson was really delighted with his young friend from Harvard. What they had in common is they had both gone to Harvard. That's how they got to know each other. He thought Thoreau was brash, irreverent, rebellious, and very amusing. One of the anecdotes about Thoreau was that he was told that he was reprimanded when he became a school teacher. He was reprimanded by the administration because he refused to beat the students. That was part of the way they educated students back then. And he just thought it was ridiculous. So he responded, he went in and he picked two or three kids at random, hit them with a stick, walked out and never showed up again, just to show them, how ridiculous that idea was. He was a disciple of Emerson, but I think it's also important to say it wasn't just he wasn't just the what you would call the subaltern. He wasn't below Emerson anyway. It was mentorship as a kind of mutuality. And Emerson entrusted Thoreau with many sacred duties, including coming to live in his home while he went away to Europe. And, when he sent him to get Margaret Fuller's paper. So they were close, and they again, intellectual partnership, again, the theme of the role of friendship as being really important in Transcendentalism. Thoreau was kind of an eccentric genius. He had a very strange and prickly character. It's said that he moved as if fired up by some kind of pent up energy. He walked with his head lowered so he could study the ground for anything of interest in plant or animal life that might come while he was walking. He was known to say, don't you like to walk with other people? And he said, why would I ruin a perfectly good walk by inviting somebody else to come along with me on this walk? So he was very content in himself, and he just loved nature and his studies of nature. Emerson said about Thoreau, he was bred to no profession. He never married. He lived alone. He never went to church. He never voted. He refused to pay a tax to the state. He ate no flesh. He drank no wine. He never knew the use of tobacco. And though a naturalist, he used neither trap nor gun. So he was really a very interesting kind of person. Emerson said of Thoreau, he had no talent for wealth. And you might think that their influence on each other was reciprocal, and they both had very different kinds of talents. Thoreau was said to be a practical transcendentalist. He was applied transcendentalism. He was good at working with his hands. He had skills at being a surveyor. His family owned a pencil factory. But, so they had their relationships were close, but there were struggles also as a part of it. And of course, I don't know the details of their struggles, but we do know that they it could be changeable at times in their relationship. Some feel that he was really moonstruck with Lydian. And actually, there's a Gothic historical novel, Gothic romance called Mr. Emerson's Wife that imagines a love affair between Lydian and Henry David Thoreau. And, did they have a sexual relationship? I don't even think that's important, but they really, they were quite taken with each other. And he really admired her. And of course, he was living there for sometimes a year at a time when Ralph was traveling and stuff. Thoreau could kind of be extreme at times, but this kind of his energy, it tended to invigorate Waldo. So you can see that, he needed, he was austere type of person. And so they fed upon each other in that way. In terms of their writing styles, Emerson went for kind of more aphoristic style. And some people feel that Thoreau was ultimately the better writer. It was went more for a narrative style. But the thing that they both had in common was that they were both capable of living with astonishing intensity for many months at a time. As I mentioned, he was a kind of a natural historian. He loved studying about nature. He was skilled at surveying. He spent one night in jail for failing to pay a poll tax. And he spoke for nonviolent resistance against unjust laws, not just slavery, but against the Mexican Wall and US governmental policies in general. He said, under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison. So he lived between 1845 and 1847 at Walden Pond. Actually, Emerson was the owner of Walden. He had bought it earlier, but Thoreau went to live there and build his famous cabin there. And he was there for a couple of years. And in truth, Walden was not really in the middle of nowhere. At least that was the impression that I had about it. It was less than 2 miles from Concord. So sometimes Thoreau would walk for Sunday dinner to his family's home or to the Emerson's home. So one of the things that Thoreau talked about a lot was this idea of the natural sublime. And you can really say that his nature writing had an ongoing effect even to this day. On environmentalism. He was said to be the father of the idea of the natural and national and state parks. And one of his famous quotations is, "In wildness is the preservation of the world." We will see that he actually died in 1862. while the Civil War was still raging at the young age of 44, and of tuberculosis. So again, another sad thing that Emerson had to put up with. It's important also to share about his thought. One of the famous quotations from him is, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." He was concerned about the increasing complexity of modern life, and he said, "Simplify, simplify." And this is where we get the phrase about the different drummer. If a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music which he hears, however measured or far away. He also said about his going to Walden, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, to discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life." So here's to that idea. He thought that there was really a richness in ordinary events that should be celebrated. So that's a little bit about Thoreau. In 1838, Waldo gave a talk which is called the Harvard Divinity School Address. He was asked to come and speak. There was a graduating class of divinity students, I think only 7 or 8. He was asked to come and speak. And this was the time at which he chose to really speak out loud and clear against formal organized religion. He felt that this was the time he was going to go public with his religious views. And he was really frustrated that preachers always stuck to biblical examples, as if there hadn't been any new revelations or insights in over 2,000 years. He was frustrated by the stationariness of lots of religion, and that this idea that the age of inspiration was a long, long time in the past. So this particular talk that he gave was a very celebrated heretical discourse. And he got a lot of flack for it eventually. He was talking about the gospel of the present moment. And it was a declaration of the divinity of the human. He talked about, one of the phrases was the influx of the divine mind into our mind, that God is in mind and nature. This is that concept I talked about earlier about hypertheism, that we have this personal intuition of religious truth. He had a pretty unorthodox view about the humanity of Jesus. He thought that the way that the Bible stuck ideas about miracles in there was in direct conflict with science, and he spoke against that. He thought that he had great reverence for Jesus, but he did not think that Jesus was God. He thought God was revealed in nature. And he also thought the New Testament lacked epic integrity. Now, I don't exactly know what that means, but I think as a piece of writing, it didn't do it for him. He did not really like it. Emerson was actually the godfather of a famous thinker, psychologist, philosopher, William James, who wrote the book Varieties of Religious Experience. And when he talked about the varieties of religious experience, he brought up Emerson as being an example of religion not being a creed, but or relating to a church or some sort of tradition, but being an experience. That Emerson was really key in this idea of the privatization of the religious. Of course, it's not a new idea like that. It took them all the way till the 19th century to, lots of people had that idea throughout history. But William James said of Emerson, posterity will reckon him a prophet. And of course, we're still reading him to this day. James said, the matchless eloquence with which Emerson proclaimed the sovereignty of the living individual electrified and emancipated his generation. So these words which he spoke at his old alma mater, of course, caused a lot of controversy. And he was accused of vagueness, inconsistency, impiety, nonsense, blasphemy, foulest of atheism. And it kind of, he should have known that was going to happen. And he wasn't naive, but being directly confronted with that really did upset him. Kind of drew him out of his equilibrium for a while. He became hurt and bitter. And really he became cut off from the Unitarian Church, as well as Harvard, the school. And he said he was impressed at how society could how quickly could whip an individual for not conforming. In around 1840, the Transcendentalist Club was over, and they founded a magazine called The Dial. Didn't last that long. It was hard to make it work. They had 300 subscribers, but Margaret Fuller became the editor. And, they published a lot of interesting articles, which was a key source of bringing together transcendentalist thinking. One of the early articles that Thoreau and Emerson collaborated on was what they called ethnical scriptures, where they're presenting excerpts from the scriptures of all the major world religions. So you might say that it was anticipating the ecumenical movement in America and giving respect for legends and mythologies of lots of different religions. It's important to talk here about kind of the development of Waldo's marriage and how that was going, if you will. You might say that Emerson was living in an emotional open marriage in the 1840s. Again, I don't know with whom he had sexual relations, and it's not really important, but he was actively having lots of relationships with women, friendships, intellectual partnerships with women. Lydian was perfectly well aware of his relationship with Margaret Fuller and with Carolyn Sturgis. It's pretty clear that he at least had a big crush on Carolyn Sturgis, and she was in his life, and then she kind of flitted out of his life. But also accompanying all these relationships was he talked in his journals about the institution of marriage. He said marriage is okay, but he had some real doubts about institution. He said marriage should be a temporary relation. Everything is free but marriage. So it certainly is not always easy, and I know what he's talking about. They stayed married, and they actually had a good relationship throughout their life, but it was filled with struggle. His relationships with women were also, for example, Margaret Fuller would complain to him about his personal distance. She accused him of inhospitality of soul. She wanted a closer relationship with him, and he was uncomfortable with that. And it almost severed their relationship at some point, but he didn't want to sabotage the partnership that they had. So he did everything that he could to kind of keep that relationship going. So he took pains not to break it off with her in any way. He was interested in not in joining these socialist communes at the time. He just, even though he was good friends with the person who founded it, he said he would not join. He preferred to just expand his own domestic circle. He didn't want to be involved in communal life. He was respectful of the goals, but he ultimately thought, and this makes sense to me, kind of knowing his thinking, that it was kind of shallow, too optimistic, and mechanical. Again, and it's also consistent with his idea of self-reliance. He preferred self-determination and independence than to live in a community of people. He really cherished his independence. Around this time, then, rather than joining the community, Thoreau came to live with the Emersons, and he had regular meetings at his house with Alcott, another fellow named Lane. Lydian called them the sages, so they met often. So he was hungry for conversation and for society, and that was created at his home. Around 1841, he published his first book. The essay Nature that we talked about earlier was in that book. And here I just want to mention one of the things that drew me to Emerson. I saw that he had a lecture on Plato and one on circles. I thought, circles? That's great. Maybe he's going to talk about 2 pi r is the circumference of a circle. I don't know. But I found out that his lecture on circles actually was that circles he really should have called it ripples, because he's not so much talking of the circle as being the circumference of equidistant around a center point, but he's talking about the ever flowing abundance of the present moment, that there's a center point that keeps overflowing. And it makes sense given what his thinking is, that he would see it that way, that why would we go to the past to get for inspiration, that there's life comes to us in circles. So I just wanted to mention that. In 1842, it was a very, very sad year for him. Thoreau came down, Thoreau's brother, John, came down with lockjaw and died. And then Thoreau got really sick. He did not die at that point. His son, little Waldo, came down with scarlatina, I guess a type of scarlet fever, on January 24th, and he died on January 27th. He was only 6 or 7 years old. And Emerson's grief knew no bounds. It was deep, real, and immediate. He said, grief, desolating grief, came over me like a flood. And he just started to doubt any justice in the universe. Over time, he wrote one of his famous poems, it was called Threnody, about grief. And he says, and looking over the hills, I mourn the darling who shall not return. And so at this time, Lydian, also being kind of constitutionally a little bit weak emotionally, she headed into a decline that would last really for the rest of her life. She would kind of come in and out of these depressions. Yet at the same time, because they both shared this grief of losing their son, it brought them closer together in some ways. Their letters show this kind of dependence on each other and affection between them. And eventually he does pick himself back up and he starts back on the lecture circuit again. He starts to get his previously lukewarm policy about abolitionism now becomes red hot. He delivered a fiery emotional speech around this time. What made him change? Well, he was looking at emancipation in the West Indies. My mother was from Jamaica, West Indies, part of the British Empire, and they actually had outlawed slavery in 1834. So that example was already out there, that they had freed their slaves way before America did. Lydian was a strong abolitionist ever since 1837. Actually, what she started doing, that she was just appalled at the existence of slavery in this country. And so rather than celebrating the 4th of July, Lydian would take black cloth and hang it all over the fence in front of their house. That was her way of protesting. He was also really impressed by Toussaint Louverture, who was from Haiti. And that's interesting in its own right. In 1791, in Haiti, there was a slave rebellion. And if you can look in Wikipedia, so like slave rebellions, how many slave rebellions ever worked? Well, that's the thing about slave rebellions. There's a very low chance of them ever working. So to me, it's very interesting that Haiti, it was a slave rebellion that actually worked. Of course, it was a struggle, and I would love to learn more about Toussaint Louverture. But of course, Emerson read about Louverture and got him thinking that maybe he should get mobilized. And his Aunt Mary was also really encouraging everybody to get on board with abolitionism. He started advocating abolition in his Lyceum lectures. He was actively assisting the local Underground Railroad. He would speak at rallies. And again, this is even a decade before abolitionism became respectable. Well, you can certainly say it was always respectable to my way of thinking, but it became more popular, at least. So we already talked a little bit about Walden Pond, but going backwards a little bit in time, he bought this property in Walden, and he would spend time there. And I never knew that. I just thought it was Thoreau's place. I really never knew that Emerson was part of it. And he starts looking at one of his essays. He published a second book of essays. One of his essays was called Experience. And he talks in this about the kind of, he said, everyone is that life, you have these experiences that goes in fits and starts. And he found that, he said, the only thing grief has taught me is how shallow it is, that like all the rest plays about the surface and never introduces me into a reality. And I won't read this whole quotation from him here, but he found it difficult to get back to that deep feeling of grief that he had experienced with his son's death, which is not to say that he didn't grieve his death throughout his life, but this is what he was trying to describe in that lecture. I have mentioned this theme throughout the talk here about he is looking to the East for inspiration, and he strongly respects Eastern thinking. He read the Bhagavad Gita. He discovered Hafez. He's reading Rumi. He loves Sufism. And basically, one of the ideas of Sufism is its belief that there is a secret teaching contained in every religion. And he called Sufism the practical pantheism of Asia. He's reading Rumi, he's reading Omar Khayyam, all of whom talked about the symbolic nature of the world and teaching through parables and through symbols. And so I find that interesting because, of course, I love Rumi, and Rumi's been around for 700 years. So certainly I'm not the only first person to just discover Rumi, but it's really fascinating that he too loved Rumi and Persian poetry. And he found this form of poetry really affected his own poetry. He published a poem called The Sphinx, which was inspired by some of the ideas he's encountering at that time. It gave his poems, as compared to his writing, his poems had this kind of ecstatic, prophetic note, and it allowed him to give voice to what you might call his Dionysian side, this wild, ecstatic side of him. Despite his aura of calm and sobriety, his poems didn't seem that way. One of the things that Emerson did every morning was he had pie for breakfast. So that was interesting to me. He's like, well, that sounds like a good idea. Wouldn't a piece of apple pie for breakfast be great? So he needed ecstatic experience, these moments of incredible illumination, but he also had his routine of pie for breakfast. In 1846, they finally brought in a housekeeper to take care of their house, and they decided to run their home as a boarding house. So they became boarders in their own home. This lightened some of the burdens on Lydian, and it didn't really last for that long. All the children, the Emerson children, were raised on a strict vegetarian diet, which is interesting. And he also got interested in cultivating fruit trees. So it became kind of a little passion with him. He had 100 fruit trees planted. He planted plums, apples, pears, and quince. And again, he's pursuing here what you would call the everyday connection between the cultivation of the soil and the life of the mind. In 1847, Emerson took off again for Liverpool, and his lectures in England were really a great success. He was really the rock star of Europe, and I hadn't really understood that before. You think of Emerson as this, American intellectual, but he was really popular in Europe. At this time, his formerly close relationship with Thomas Carlyle starts to go south. Carlyle had a kind of ingrained pessimism that started to really bug the very optimistic Emerson. And he said about Carlyle, he was protectionist in political economy, aristocrat in politics, epicure in diet, goes for murder, money, punishment by death, slavery, and all the petty abominations. So I just think he was really just they really getting irritated with him, and they disagreed on lots and lots of things, but they didn't break off their relationship with each other. They continued a correspondence throughout their entire life, but it was often filled with backbiting, catty comments. But even though they were fighting, Carlyle took Emerson to see Stonehenge, which is interesting, and he wrote, I think, an essay about his experience at Stonehenge. I'd love to see that. Now, if you know about history at that time in Europe, 1848 was kind of like 1968. It was a time when there were just revolutions all over the place. And there was Emerson in the middle of all of these important revolutions. When he was in England, there was something called the Chartist Revolution. Now, I had heard about that, but I didn't know, what did they call it Chartist, and what did that have to do with anything? On April 10th, 1848, there was a large Chartist demonstration in London. And what the charter of this group, which is why they call themselves Chartist, the charter of this group, they had 6 points: universal male suffrage, equal-sized constituencies, no property qualifications for Parliament, a secret ballot, annual parliaments, and salaries for MPs. And of course, if you think about it, if you don't pay people. It's not a true democracy because only rich people can serve in the government. And, it was just starting to open up democracy more and more and define that. So he was there. He learned a lot from that experience. It affected his thinking. And then he goes over to Paris, where there's another nice revolution happening while he happens to be there. There was a group called in May of 1848, while he was there, a group of socialists called the Blousons. A blouson is the type of shirt that was worn by the workers. They started to agitate in a reaction to the decline of King Louis Philippe, and ultimately it was not successful, but he was there while there was a revolt and barricades are being thrown up and fighting in the streets and all of that. So even though Emerson saw these revolutionary movements, when he came back home, he was still more interested in the problem of the individual. It did not really suck him in. When he came home, he had a quarrel with Thoreau, and it separated them for a little while. Thoreau had been living in Emerson's house while he was in England, and Thoreau was skeptical of, and this makes sense given what we know about him. Thoreau was skeptical about his success in England. He thought he was being materialist. He was skeptical about speed and talking and steam power and all of this stuff that was going on, and how Emerson was relishing all of it. He disapproved. He was, more what's the right word? Austere, I guess, than that Thoreau's idea. And Thoreau had been working on a long piece called A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers at this time. And I guess Emerson made some criticisms of its weaknesses, and Thoreau got really mad. And so they kind of cooled their relationship for a while. Emerson also, on the other hand, too, Emerson also recognized in Thoreau a kind of a dark quality at its inner core, a capacity for renunciation and rigidity. The ability to say no created a wall around Thoreau. He was unapproachable. He was drawn into a well of isolation that was ultimately sort of destructive for him. And Emerson said about Thoreau, it's a misfortune of Thoreau's life that he has no appetite. He neither eats nor drinks. What can you have in common with a man who does not know the difference between ice cream and cabbage and who has no experience of wine or ale? So you can see their differences made it difficult for their relationship at times. But they both of them had forgiveness in them. They did remain friends, and although their intimacy would change significantly, they were still friends. And Emerson always thought very highly of Thoreau and thought of him as his best friend, despite it all. I just want to mention here his interest in history. We talked earlier about the influence that Margaret Fuller had on him, about biography as being the best way to talk about history. He felt that through biography, we see our links to the great people of the past, that we can educate the present generation by looking at past generations, and that through understanding people from the past, through their biography, we know more about their lives and how they lived. So he wrote a series of lectures on people from history: Plato, Shakespeare, Napoleon, Swedenborg, Goethe, and that was part of his view on biography as history. Around this time, I just want to mention he starts going out west. There's more and more railroads being built, and he loved the West. He visited Cincinnati. He visited Mammoth Cave. He went to St. Louis, and he ended up returning to the West every year after that. In the mid 1850s, Emerson's political radicalism really gets rekindled. He starts giving speeches on Kansas, where there's all sorts of fighting about slavery, John Brown's raid. And in March of 1850, Henry Clay introduced a compromise program having to do with the disposition of the territories that were acquired during the Mexican-American War of 1846 through 1848. And it included a very stringent fugitive slave law. And Daniel Webster, who had always been sort of seen as like on the side of right and goodness, actually supported the fugitive slave law. And this kind of really activated people. They said, this is disgusting. You can't make us turn in slaves, treat slaves as property and turn them back to their owners. So this really got him motivated. He actually entertained John Brown in his own home. He was a little bit cool on Lincoln because, of course, there were two different things going on in the Civil War and with Lincoln. One of them was the Union at all costs, and one of them was slavery. And Emerson wasn't sure that the Union had value at all costs, despite, I don't know what I think of that notion necessarily, but he actually forbade his son to enlist to fight in the Civil War because he felt that, Lincoln was putting it all behind the Union and it wasn't necessarily about slavery. I mentioned earlier Margaret Fuller's death and how she died in 1850. And Emerson was, he proposed a memorial volume of her work, and he started working on it as a labor of love. But her death hit him really hard, and it was becoming harder and harder for him to spring back after all of these kind of setbacks he's experiencing. I put here on this page a picture of Karl Marx because it's also interesting to realize that Karl Marx, this is when he was writing as well, and Emerson read Marx. And he could see what Marx was talking about, the inevitable nature of social change. He saw what was happening with the Chartists in England and with the laboring classes, which made him actually quite receptive to Marx's reasoning. At this time, Lydian is unwell most of the time. She's up in bed, and it is said that Waldo abhorred illness as much as Lydian practically rejoiced in ill health. And he just was like, come on, just, get it together. I think there were tensions around that. But I guess they reached some accommodation in their relationship. And also at this time, his rift with Thoreau starts to heal around 1851. It took a few years. At this time, Emerson, by the mid 1850s, Emerson was dangerously famous, you might say. He was drawing attacks and adulation, both. The people watched his every move, and I don't think I realized previously just that what a big personality he was. And what he said hardly mattered. He was just a famous guy. One journalist said, we were all very much instructed by looking at Mr. Emerson's face and seeing him think. So he didn't say we were instructed by the brilliance of his ideas. They were instructed by looking at his face and watching him think. And again, when he was in England, they called it Emerson mania. People were just wild about him. The papers reported on all of his lectures. And actually, he didn't really like that, because he would deliver his lectures over and over again. And he's like, come on, newspapers, stop reporting on my stuff. You're taking my material. But he just, like, every word that he spoke was covered. And of course, at the same time, lots of folks satirized him, and he was the butt of lots of different jokes. Around 1855, Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman is published, and it was presented to Emerson. Emerson found it, the quotation is, extraordinary for its oriental largeness of generalization. He says, this is the best piece of American Buddhism that anyone has had strength to write, American to the bone. And it was known that he wrote to Emerson, to Whitman, and said, I greet you at the beginning of a great career. And Whitman got the New York Tribune to print Emerson's letter. And then he had a second edition published that had Emerson's name stamped on the spine. Now, some people think, oh, then, he got so mad at Walt Whitman and that would have ended their relationship. It did not end their relationship. Emerson was a bit miffed. Whitman had not given him permission to get his endorsement and to print it like that. But he found it rude, but it had no effect on his enthusiasm for Whitman's work, the great poet. They met in March of 1860, and they took a long walk. Emerson said, you might take all that explicitly sexual stuff out of that work. I Sing the Body Electric and all of that. And Whitman never did. And it wasn't that Emerson was scandalized by it. He just thought it wasn't a good idea, that it would hurt his ability to get his work known. They met probably about 6 times. And he really never changed his mind about Whitman. He thought his poetry was really wonderful. And likewise, when Whitman said about meeting with Emerson, he said, my ideas were simmering, and Emerson brought them to a boil. So it's wonderful to think that Emerson played a role in Walt Whitman's poetry. Whitman said Emerson was a born Democrat, and whereas Thoreau had a contempt for the masses of men. That was Whitman's view. Emerson could feel Whitman's warmth and friendliness, and he said, I never get tired of talking to him. What Emerson said about Whitman was his manner carried with it something penetrating and sweet beyond mere description. There is in some men an indefinable something which flows out and over you like a flood of light. Never a face was more gifted with power to express, fascinate, and maintain. And I have certainly read about Whitman's work with soldiers in the Civil War, and he did have he was a tremendously compassionate person. So that's neat to see that they affected each other in that way. Around this time, Emerson is really starting to feel old. The Civil War has started. 23,000 men die at the Battle of Shiloh, and it's just a really, really difficult time to be alive in America. Although his memory is starting to be in decline, he's still publishing. He writes a series of poems called Quatrains, but he's starting to appear less and less in public because his memory is failing, and he's just embarrassed by that. At the same time, he didn't really know how to stop working. He had a habit of writing that outlived his capacity to write. So he's still working, but it is a struggle for him. He famously takes a trip out to California. He actually met George Pullman. He met Brigham Young at this time. But California clearly caught his imagination, and he met with John Muir. And John Muir is the curly-haired person shown in the picture. And they spent 2 days together. Muir said about Emerson, Emerson was the most serene, majestic, sequoia-like soul I have ever met. His smile was as sweet and calm as morning light on mountains. So, I mean, it's a kind of a universal description. A lot of people he must have been just a really neat person to be around. His house caught fire in 1872, another tragedy in his life. And hang on a second. And his papers and his books were mostly not burned, thank God. But it affected him profoundly. He became exhausted and ill. His memory, his power of attention was even worse. He did take another trip to Europe with his daughter Ellen, and he was, he had a good time of that, but he wasn't lecturing as much. When he came home, it's interesting to hear that he was such a celebrity that when he arrived home in Concord, the train blew its whistle all the way in, and the whole town turned out to welcome him home. The school was actually canceled just to welcome him home. I mean, it was really big how famous and how appreciated that he was. His memory continues to fail throughout this time, and it became a serious embarrassment. He really didn't go out in public anymore. He avoided social situations. He stayed home, and he did work with his daughter Ellen on a book called The 100 Greatest Men. So I don't know if they ever put that book together about the 100 greatest men. On the last day of his life, April 19th, 1882, Emerson went out walking, and he got, that wasn't the last day of his life. Sorry, that was 6 days before the last day of his life. He went out walking, and he came down with pneumonia. 6 days later, he died. Despite his son Edward's warning, Father, you should stay in bed. The day that he died, he got up, he got dressed, he went to his study. After tea, he lit a fire, and he headed upstairs with his lamp. And that was the last time he went upstairs. It's funny because when I was first reading Richardson's biography about Emerson, I got to the last page and I started crying. And my husband's like, "Why are you crying?" I said, "Well, because Ralph Waldo Emerson died." He said, "Well, you knew before you read this that he was going to die, right?" But it was just, I just really felt that I admired him, and that he was a hero to me. He's called the Sage of Concord, and he is buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, very near Nathaniel Hawthorne and Henry David Thoreau. And someday when I decide to start traveling again, I'd like to go there and see his grave. So.